Altriz Wormwood, better known by many as the Undying Scourge, opened a gateway to the terraformed landscape of a dirtball out in backwater space with a flourish and a flick of his tendril-laden hand, face set in unwavering determination. My armies have been depleted, but it matters none. I will simply raise a new one. Battles with cosmic forces of light and justice had rendered the necromage's previous armies null, repelling his attacks and freeing his thralls' souls from their corpses before Altriz could overwhelm and convert the damned flower-sniffing, life-loving freaks. Altriz walked through the ghastly green ethereal portal of his own construction, leaving the tattered moon he'd been hiding out on, following his last defeat behind and embracing a new world, one he recognized the landscape of even if he couldn't fully identify it. Once he arrived, he scowled, immediately assaulted by the scent of verdant greenery. It burned his eyes, made his tentacles spasm, made his nostrils tingle and flare. Covering his face, Altriz took to the skies and searched for some place on the planet more forgiving, more accepting of his particular penchant for death and decay. When he first felt a wave of putrescence hit him, his senses cried out in relief. He immediately sailed towards the area, careening through the air and feeling he could finally breathe once the foresty surroundings from before started to bleed into a rough and desolate plain with a sulfuric tinge that Altriz couldn't quite place. He landed with a slight bend of the legs and immediately set to work on scanning the area with his system, trying to determine the cause of said smell and just how many dead lay in the area. Results came fast, and though they didn't account for every aspect of Altriz's questions, they at least told him what he'd suspected was true, and that was that this site was the spot of a long-forgotten battle, that the dead here had lingered for a long, long time, and that some kind of chemical weaponry was used to great effect in this conflict, if the far-reaching span of dead land was any indication. These spirits would be vengeful, Altriz mused. They died without having their honor fulfilled, without having a chance to fight for what they cared for. They will be easy to bend, break, and otherwise convert. Altriz took stock of the corpses. He was taken aback by the number. 110,000 skeletons. It is more than twice what I've scrounged from the last 3 battlefields I've visited. He could only hope these spirits were powerful enough to back up that impressive number with some substance. He pulled out a single skeleton from deep within the earth, ripping inside and plucking out the bones and arranging them all neatly in what he assumed was their proper place, preparing to perform his foul ritual. The vertebrate creature he'd arranged looked nothing like anything he'd seen before. A scan counted 206 bones, and after some time and consideration he realized where they all went, and managed to reconstruct an image of a creature with both 2 arms and 2 legs, bipedal like him, and yet completely different in height and shape and thickness to other such creatures the necromage had encountered. He brought up a handful more skeletons to compare, looking between each of them to determine this was the status quo of whichever species this was before finally being satisfied. Animating the first skeleton and watching as the bones perfectly arranged themselves, and the creature went from floating and glowing green to merely glowing, staring at its new master in a permanent smile. "The fuck's going on?" the skeleton said, and Altriz blinked hard. "What did you say?" The skeleton mimed, yawning, stretching as he spoke. "I said, the fuck is going on? I was asleep 5 seconds ago, and now I'm sat here chatting with your ugly mug, so can you fill me in, or am I going back to sleep?" "What?" For the first time in centuries, Altriz felt the urge to read over the forbidden tome once again for clarity on the summoning arts he'd purportedly mastered. Coughing, he fought for his composure as best he could. Thralls can be difficult sometimes, he reminded himself. He had to not lose his head. You're a dead warrior. Your immortal soul has lingered in the ether for time immemorial, and now, at your time of reckoning, I, the Undying Scourge, have come to bring you into my service. The tall skeleton stared down at him for a few moments, then burst into laughter. "Fuck off. You had me going for a sec. You really sell it with your yold mystic talk, you know." "You are dead." Composure completely out the window at this point. Altriz summoned a long mirror, thrusting it in front of the unliving construct of his own design and pointing his finger at it. Look at yourself and tell me you haven't long departed this world." There was a long pause as the skeleton admired its own visage in the mirror. inspecting its teeth and tapping a bony finger against its chin. Eventually, it shrugged. Nah, fake news, bud. I'd know if I was dead. I wouldn't be sat here talking to you for a start. Grrr. With a fitful kick, robes ruffling, Altriz set about the process of reviving another skeleton, completely ignoring the blabbering nonsense of the first. Perhaps he'd happen to resurrect an outlier, and the rest would be more to the speed of the usual dead he encountered. The second skeleton returned to life with a shout, moving back 3 paces and looking all around like he was utterly befuddled, before finally his eyes locked with the first skeleton. Keith? Matty boy, the first skeleton roared, running over to his companion with a skitter of gangly skelly legs, clapping his fallen comrade on the back. How the fuck do you recognize me? Total guess, mate. Just figured if I took too many edibles with someone, it had to have been you. Ah, fuck, are we tripping balls right now? Skeleton 1 nodded to himself a few times as if to affirm his own theory. We're tripping balls. Sarge will fucking murder us if he catches us, man. We're on thin ice as it is, mate. You've already been murdered, by a thermoplasmic device if I'm not mistaken. Who the fuck's this? Skeleton 2 asked, still a little wobbly. He pointed a long bony finger at Altriz. Can you see him too? Yeah, that's weird, ain't it? He was telling me something about me being dead or something. Oh fuck, man. Skeleton 2 staggered up to Altriz, waving the same finger he'd pointed with in reprimand. Look, man, you can't say shit like that to people when they're high. They'll believe you. You gotta be smooth, you know. No bad vibes. That was the issue. He didn't believe me. Altriz wasn't sure why he was trying to reason with these creatures. Previous experience had not prepared him for this eventuality. What will it take for you to believe me? You're in a wasteland surrounded by your 1,000 years dead comrades. All right, don't shout, yeah? Skeleton 2 continued. Look, just because you're Cthulhu's little cousin or whatever, doesn't mean you get to come in here and fuck with our vibe. Chill a little. Have an eddy. Altriz had no clue what in the world an eddy was, but he was rather sure that it wasn't going to get him his undead army any sooner. Neither was talking to these two, though. Then, when all hope seemed lost, when Altriz was about to wipe these two away and try again from scratch, Skeleton 2 piped up, raising his hand to speak. Altriz rubbed at his forehead. Yes? All right, I've just had a consultation with my good friend here, and we've come to the conclusion that we're both skeletons. A pause. And that probably the other stuff you said was true as well. A light, however faint in this darkest and most frustrating of encounters. Altriz dared to hope. Does that mean you're willing to hear my proposal? Not really. It means we're wondering why the fuck we're skeletons. Altriz felt a vein beginning to bulge in his forehead. What? We were dead, yeah. Dead, rotten. In the ground, gone. Skeleton 1 pointed at one of the not-yet-animate skeletons as example. Like that one. Yes? And it was pretty chill, like a big sleep. Altriz nodded, impatient. And then you woke us up, see the problem? Altriz scowled at the pair. Yes, most certainly I do now. It wasn't difficult to prepare a suitable spell of subjugation. Many creatures were more willing to serve in death, but to deal with pesky, strong-spirited armies such as this one, a simple means to bind the creatures into service would suffice. As Altriz recited the ancient chant, the two skeletons looked at him as if he were utterly mental. When he was finally finished, and the sigil lines had been painted across the air and affixed in every direction around the battlefield, hundreds of feet long throughout the sky, the first skeleton was tapping his foot. Listen, mate, I think we've been pretty patient with you so far, but if we're dead, this is kinda like our new house now, and no one actually invited you, so if you'd kindly take back our consciousness and fuck off. Altriz stared desperately up at the spell lines decorating the air for half a mile all around him, lines he'd mastered over centuries of application and use, lines he'd hoped would finally silence the inane chatter of the creature before him, would bend him into servitude, would be worth the depletion of his mana. Why isn't it working? Desperately, Altriz began to raise more and more skeletons, hoping to find a cooperative one. Spencer. Holy shit, boys, how high are we? Davey? Nah, quiet down, I'll be up in a minute. Hadak Choi Buzu Narg. What did you get him up for? He's from the other army. Altriz poured increasing levels of mana into his spell, clamping spectral chains to the warriors as he raised hundreds, thousands of them, affixing each chain to his tendrils and using them to pull the warriors closer, to bind them in place. Each flourish of his hand and tightening of the spell a testament to his many years of necromancy, his prowess. You are dead, forgotten souls. You have no will, no place, no power, and you will serve me unto your final death and call me master. For I am the Undying Scourge, and you are only— Piss off. I am not working with fucking Gary again. You'll have to torture me. Do we get a decent healthcare package, dental? Fuck me, you ever heard of human rights, or are those optional where you're from? In the flurry of responses from hundreds of dead warriors, the necromancer caught an unfamiliar word. Only it was incredibly familiar all the same. It wasn't unfamiliar because he didn't understand it, only because it was clamped right at the front of the forbidden tome, in one of the earliest chapters in big, bold letters. The name of a species he'd never, as of yet, encountered. Human. That passage went on to describe a race so unsusceptible to magical influence that it literally had zero effect on them. A race capable of rebelling against every command a necromancer dared utter. A race so entirely free from the clutches of magical influence that certain empires had steered clear of their solar system entirely on the grounds that they were deemed unconquerable. And Altriz had managed to stumble onto one of their worlds without realizing. The folly. I'll do it if you pay me. I was a lieutenant before I died, so you've got to pay me more. No, you weren't, you lying bonebag cunt. You just want to one-up us. I was. I had a degree in law before I signed up, so they made me an officer. Okay, name 10 laws. Altriz opened another portal and left at some point during that exchange, one of many that were currently taking place on the battlefield, that the incredibly mana-intensive resurrection spell was still tearing through. Well, that was a total fucking waste of time, fucking humans. Altriz sighed, staring through his dreary lair. Being a necromancer sucked. He'd only done it because he had really terrible hay fever, and dead shit didn't make him sneeze. He poured himself a glass of wine, thinking over his most recent failures, his legacy, the 400 years he'd spent trying and failing to usher the universe into a new era of death and darkness. He concluded that he'd gotten a little high-strung lately, perhaps a bit lonely too. Altriz probably did need to chill. Maybe instead of rebuilding my army of the dead, I'll go find out what an eddy is next. There was always a chance he could pay the dead earthlings with them.